this quickly. I forgot to fix this before I started. All right, there we go. All right. Good evening, gentlemen. We are holding in the middle of chapter 7 of the second part of the Tanya. Shaar HaYichud, the gate of unity and faith. Chapter 7 is dealing with a fundamental truth of God, which is that God is a king. God is referred to as a king, right? As we say every morning, Adon Elam, the master of the world, the king. God is a king over the world. The thing is that his kingship is very important because the only reason, as we've explained at length in the previous 6 chapters, the only reason why the world appears to us to be an independent reality, to be a reality that exists independent of God, the only reason it seems that way is because God wanted to be a king. What's the connection? A king is only truly a king over subjects. There is no such thing as being a king alone, right? You can't be a king. If you're the only person on earth, you can't be a king. In fact, the truth is, as the Alter Rebbe has already said, at the beginning of chapter 7, you can't even be a king over your own children, right? Imagine if you had a state or a country, right, that was populated entirely by one family, right? You have a king, and the king has 1 million children, right? Such a king is not a king. You can't be a king over your children. You can't even be a king over your employees, over ministers. Why is this the case? This is inherent to the nature of kingship, at least kingship as it's understood in Torah, the Torah idea of a king. Why can you not be king over family or over even your own ministers or your own employees? Because familiarity breeds contempt, right? If you are close to the king, he can't really be a king. There is an inherent distance factor in being a king. There needs to be a king and a nation. And the nation, the whole idea of the nation is Am. Am is nation in Hebrew. And Am is also related to the Hebrew words omemos, which means extinguished embers, extinguished coals, that the light of the king does not shine in them. Right? In other words, the nation does not have an appreciation of who the king truly is. If you were to truly know the king, he couldn't be your king anymore. The whole idea of a king ruling over a nation is ruling over it from a distance. Therefore, if God wishes to be king, as the Torah tells us he does, God wants to rule as a king, his kingship can only be expressed over a world that is separate from him. Not a world which is close to him or a world in which he is directly perceived. Therefore, God makes our world in the way that he does, which is a world that appears to be a reality independent from and separate from God. The appearance of the world, the fact that the world appears separate from him and independent of him, is therefore a direct result of his desire for kingship, of what's called in Hebrew malchus, the divine trait of majesty, of kingship, right? Malchus, the same root as melech, king, right? The divine trait of majesty and kingship. Now the thing is that we are actually in the middle of discussing, so what is it exactly, this is what we discussed last week, what is it exactly about the world that makes it separate from him? In other words, what is the litmus test for a world over which God can be king? And we said the litmus test is, what is it that makes a world separate from God, a reality separate from him? The test is whether it is a world within time and space. Whether it's a world with time and space. Why do time and space indicate a separation from God? Because time, the whole idea of time and space is that things are defined not by themselves but by other things. Right? For example, as we said last week, if you want to locate something on the surface of the earth, you would use north, south, east, and west, right? You would locate it in 2 dimensions. And locating it in 2 dimensions means that this thing is more east than west to a certain reference point, or it's more north than south to a certain reference point. Everything within space is defined by opposites, by division, by multiplicity. Right? In other words, a reality above time and space would be defined only by itself. You would say, if you take something that's above time and space and you say, what do I need to know about this thing? The answer would be, the thing is the thing. That's the answer to the question of everything that's above time and space. What do you mean? What do you mean the thing is the thing? Well, the thing is defined only in terms of itself, because there is no space in which there are other things by which to define it. There is no time by when to define it, right? So the thing is precisely itself. And the truth is that this is all what we spoke about last week. And the truth is that this idea of time and space is not just physical, but spiritual as well. There's such a thing as spiritual space and spiritual time, right? As the example we gave in last week's classes, that even there's two different ideas. For example, 2 + 2 = 4, right? And the Pythagorean theorem from geometry, a² + b² = c². These are two ideas which take up no physical time and space, right? They exist outside of physical time. They're true always, at all times. They don't exist in terms of time. And they don't exist in a particular place either. Tell me where they are. Where is the Pythagorean theorem, right? There's no where. It's not a spatial being, right? However, because they are in their content, they are different, right? 2 + 2 = 4 is saying something different than what a² + b² = c² is saying. Because they say something different, they occupy a different conceptual space, right? One exists over here. There's a point at which you're no longer talking about 2 + 2 = 4, and you are talking about the Pythagorean theorem. In other words, they each exist in their own space, in a spiritual sense, conceptually. The same is true of the spiritual beings in all the spiritual worlds, such as angels, for example, right? They also exist within a certain sense of space, even though it's not physical space. There's a spiritual sense of space in which they exist, right? And all of this, anything that has time and space, right, is defined in terms of its location in time and space. I can say that this is where the Pythagorean theorem is, and this is where 2 + 2 = 4 is. Or, for those of us like me who appreciate physical things that are more simple, this is where the cup is, and this is where the wallet is, right? I know I can distinguish between them simply by them not taking up the same space at the same time, right? In a world of no time and space, that would not be true. In a world of no time and space, everything would be defined simply by the fact that God creates it. The thing is the thing. God makes a thing here, and that's literally all you would be able to say about the thing. So in other words, where do we achieve separation from God, right? Because if everything is defined simply by the fact that God creates it, then everything is one. Everything is essentially the same, right? There's a unity between all things. Because you would say, what is the cup? The cup is God speaking. What is the wallet? The wallet is God speaking, right? Everything is simply an expression of God, and all expressions of God have a deep and profound unity with each other and with God, as we said last week. In time and space, however, everything has its own limited definition. The cup is here and the wallet is here. Therefore, if God wants to be king, and which means, what does it mean that he wants to be king? He wants a universe that appears independent of him, right? Where things are separate from him, then that place where things are separate must be defined by time and space. If there's no time and space, then there's no separation. Everything is one with everything else, and everything is one with God. Separation, right, is like the famous saying, I forget who originally said it, but why does time exist? So that not everything doesn't happen at the same time, right? Everything doesn't happen at the same moment. That's why time exists, right? It's the same idea. If there was no time and no space, everything would be one. What allows the separation and allows the individuation and the independence from God is time and space. And since that independence is what God is seeking because he desires to be king, therefore he creates a universe as we perceive it, a universe of time and space, etc. So the universe is really a function of his malchus, of his desire to be a king. The very foundations of reality as we perceive it regularly is all derivative of God's kingship. Now what we are going to discuss tonight is more on the topic of malchus, more on the topic of God's kingship. Because, as we know, God's kingship is only one of 10 divine attributes that the Torah teaches us, right? Kingship is the last of the 10 spheros, the last of the 10 divine emanations, the 10 building blocks with which God creates the universe. Kingship is the last. It's number 10. There are 9 others, right? And in previous classes, in previous chapters, we've discussed other ones. There's also chesed, God's kindness. There's gvura, God's self-concealment, or God's discipline, or God's severity, right? There's God expresses in many different ways. He expresses himself in many different ways. Malchus, the desire to be king, is only one of them, right? And as we are going to see, this is extremely, extremely important. This is an extremely important point because all of this is driving towards a discussion of what's called Yichud Ilah and Yichud Tata, the higher level unity and the lower level unity of God, which are represented. The higher level is what we speak about in the morning when we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That's a statement of the higher level unity. And this, what we say afterwards, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuso Le'olam Va'ed, the sentence we read, the verse we read after Shema, is the lower level unity. So all of this discussion of kingship is going to lead into beginning to understand what these two unities are. What do we mean by two levels of God's unity? Now, in general, we understand, let me review even further back to I think 3 weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. God's unity in general, in the Chassidic teachings, in what we're studying now, God's unity refers to the idea that nothing has an independent reality from God, as we've spoken about again and again and again. Nothing exists apart from God. Everything exists unified with God, as one with godliness, as an expression of godliness. However, as we said, there's really 2 aspects to this unity. There's 2 aspects to this unity. Number one is the fact that metaphysically speaking, nothing has an independent reality from God, right? In other words, when I say metaphysically speaking, I mean in actuality, the stuff of the cup, or the stuff of the idea, or the stuff of the Pythagorean theorem, or the stuff of the soul, or the stuff of the angel is merely an expression of God. That's what the first 6 chapters of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah spoke about, the first 6 chapters of the second part of Tanya. We are now in the 7th chapter. As we explained before, why is there a 7th chapter? Because there's a second idea in God's unity, which is that not only does nothing have an independent existence metaphysically apart from God, not only is there any stuff that exists independent of God, but also nothing other than God is of any inherent importance, which is a very important idea. Nothing other than God is of inherent worth. What does that mean? That means that in order for God to truly be God, as Judaism conceives of him, as the one God, the true God, he must not be beholden to any nature. There must be nothing that compels him. There's nothing that he has to do. Right? There's no aspect of him compels that there be anything other than him, right? Because otherwise he is not there's no Achdus Hashem. He is not one God in the truest and the deepest sense, right? So for an example, let me give an example. As we said in previous classes, L'chaim, when God says, let there be light, right, at the beginning of the book of Bereshit, the beginning of the book of Genesis, when God says, let there be light, that statement seems to be attuned to creating light specifically. In other words, when he says, let there be light, it's going to create light. It's not going to create frogs, right, or fish. It's going to create light. This seems to be a rather obvious point. Why is it controversial? It's controversial because what that seems to imply is that God acts for the sake of the universe. In other words, physical light is so important, right? Physical light is of such inherent worth that God will speak specific words, will express himself in a specific way to create it. In other words, even before the universe is created, even before God says, let there be light, there is some idea of light which is important to God. It matters that there should be light, right? This is a contradiction to Hashem's unity, because what this says is that even before the universe exists, it still is throwing its weight around. It still has some relevance. It's still compelling the Creator to create it in some sense. Obviously, we don't mean compulsion like you would force a person to do something, right? It's obviously a different type of thing. But the point is that apparently, in order to get light, you can't say, let there be fish. You have to say, let there be light. And because light is important to God and fulfilling some need that God has, God forbid to say such a thing, but seems to be fulfilling some purpose, right? That God has for it. Therefore, he says specifically, let there be light, and not let there be whatever else, right? In that occasion, if you understand what I'm saying. So in other words, the universe has, it would seem, an importance in godliness, even though, as we explained in the first 6 chapters of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, the universe really is nothing else other than an expression of God. There is no light, right? There is only let there be light. There is no light itself, right? Light itself is merely God speaking the light into existence constantly, and that's all that truly exists, and it's only in our perception that light exists independent of the godly expression, which is a very, very brief and simple summary of the first 6 chapters. But even at this level, it appears that when God says, let there be light, the light still exists in some way. It doesn't exist as an independent stuff or an independent matter, right? All that is here is let there be light. But even implicit in the words, let there be light, light truly exists. It's truly of importance, right? It's truly relevant. So in the sense that it is important, in the sense that the divine action is directed towards creating it, the light is extremely important. It's extremely relevant. It exists in a profound sense. It truly exists. And this is contrary to the notion that nothing exists except for God. Nothing exists apart from God and godliness. So, what that apparently leaves us at is a stalemate. The stalemate is that the divine speech is the source of the world, and the world is totally not independent of the divine speech, which is an argument that the divine speech means that the world does not exist, independent of God. However, the divine speech, just by being the divine speech, just by saying, let there be light, we apparently now introduce a contradiction, where by him saying, let there be light, the world really does exist independent of him in some sense, right? It exists in the sense of it has importance, right? It has its own. God is acting towards that end of creating it. So you have a paradox. On the one hand, the world doesn't exist because light, let's use light specifically. Light doesn't exist because God says, let there be light, and all there is let there be light. Light is not independent from let there be light. All there is the words, let there be light, constantly. That's what light is. On the other hand, because God is saying, let there be light, there must be light. Light is of importance. Light has an inherent worth and inherent value. This is the inherent problem that the Alter Rebbe is writing chapter 7 to explain. That's what chapter 7 is here for. Chapter 7 is to explain how this is not a contradiction to the unity of God. That God says, let there be light, and thereby lends the creation importance. By the very thing that in the first 6 chapters explained why the world is nothing, in chapter 7 we realize that that very thing is what means that the world must be something of importance. How do we answer this seeming contradiction? That's why the Alter Rebbe wrote a chapter 7. So in order to understand that, we're not going to be doing a lot of reading inside today, unfortunately, because there's a lot to explain that I have to explain before we get to the next part of... Or fortunately, depending how you look at it. I'll have to be having my poor representations instead of what the Alter Rebbe says today for most of the class, because we have a lot more to say about Malchus, about the divine kingship, before we can truly understand the answer to this question. The question is how is let there be light not a contradiction to God's unity in one way, right? In one aspect. That's the question. Hopefully by the end of tonight's class we'll see the answer in the distance, and then next week we'll hopefully learn it inside, God willing. Let's talk about Malchus. Let's talk about kingship. Kingship is the 10th of the 10 divine spheres, right? The 10 modes of godly expression, the 10 divine emanations by which God creates the universe. Malchus means kingship. Kingship, as we've just been explaining, is the idea that kingship is the idea of ruling over something external to you, right? Something lower than you. You need, the whole point of Malchus, the whole point of kingship, is that kingship needs the other. Kingship, Malchus, is distinct from all the other 9 spheres because Malchus needs the other. Kingship needs someone other than myself. Let's explore this idea. First of all, let's look at, on Erev Shabbos, right? We list the 10 spheres. On Erev Shabbos in the Siddur, before Mincha, right? We read the Pasach Eliyahu. The Pasach Eliyahu is basically a summary of everything in Kabbalah, if you understand anything that it says, right? The Pasach Eliyahu is a summary of everything you need to know, if you know how to read it, right? Over there it lists the 10 spheres, and it compares the 10 spheres to parts of the body, right? You have Chochmah and Bina, Chochmah is the mind, right? Bina is the heart, right? Chesed and Gvura, kindness and severity / discipline are the right arm and the left arm. Netzach and Hod are the right leg and the left leg. Yesod, it says, which is, this will be important to tonight's class. Yesod, we'll talk about this in a moment. Yesod, it says 2 things. It says, number 1, Siyuma de Gufa, which means the end of the body. Right? Eis bris kodesh, right? The bris milah is the yesod, and malchus is, who remembers? Torah Shabal Peh, right? Malchus is the oral law, mouth. The malchus is the mouth, right? Now, there's several strange things about this which should pique the curiosity immediately. First of all, we don't name anything on the face except the mouth. That's the first thing. Second of all, the mouth comes last. This is totally not in order, right? In other words, we seem to be descending through the body, right? Descending to the extremities. We start with the brain, then the heart. These are essential matters. Then we do 4 limbs, right? You do the yesod, which is the bris. I can understand if that's like an appendix or something that's on the end. And then, all of a sudden, back to the mouth. Right? It's intriguing. This is all because of the unique nature of Malchus, the unique nature of the divine kingship. Yesod, which is the last sphere before Malchus, the 9th sphere, is called Siyuma de Gufa, the end of the body. Not just because the bris is considered the end of the body, but because spiritually, Malchus is different than the other 9 spheres, than the other 9 divine expressions or divine emanations that come before it. What's the difference? The difference is that up through Yesod, we are talking about, so to speak, the person himself, right? The person himself. God expresses his own person in 9 ways, through 9 spheres, right? God expresses his person in 9 ways. But that is all talking about the person himself. Right arm, left arm, brain, heart. This is talking about the person. Malchus is how the person interacts with the world outside of him. Malchus is how the person interacts with the world outside of him. Kingship is all about the other. That is why the mouth is last. It's last not because that's the natural place it is on the body. It's last because even the yesod is an inherent quality of the thing itself. Malchus is about externalization. It's to relate to the outside. Just like speech, right? For example, just like speech. Take chesed. Chesed is kindness, love. Love comes from chesed, right? Rabbi Yoel points out that a person who's kind and is expressing his kindness, right, can express his kindness equally to their firstborn child and a dog, right? A kind person is kind, you'll notice, regardless of the recipient of the kindness, right? You can still be a kind person if you never have children. You can still express your kindness to the utmost if you never have children, right? Or you never, in fact, if you never meet another human soul, right? If you're Will Smith in I Am Legend and you only have a dog and zombies. I see that reference was recognized. Yeah, everyone knew what that meant. So the love, it doesn't matter to whom it's expressed. It's compared in Chassidus to sunlight. right? The sun naturally emanates light, just like a kind person is naturally kind, right? Whether the light falls on a palace or a landfill, right, doesn't really make a difference to the sun, because the whole point is the sun says, I'll express my light. I'm expressing my light, that's all that matters. Where the light ends up doesn't matter, right? So too a kind person is kind indiscriminately, generally speaking, right? Unless other things get involved, whatever. Obviously it gets more complicated. But the point is that to be a kind person, you don't need a specific type of recipient for the kindness, right? The same is true with understanding, by the way. To be a smart person or an understanding person, you don't need a particular type of thing to understand, right? You can understand, you can be a genius at playing poker or a genius at nuclear physics. It doesn't make a difference, right? Genius is genius. A person who's smart, who really understands things, right? Because they express their intelligence, and whatever that intelligence happens to latch onto, that's what it latches onto. But you're still expressing your intelligence to the utmost. This is not the case with Malchus, not the case with kingship. Talking, it's also not the case, but in kingship, the idea of actually ruling over, right? You realize that this is it's totally different, because you cannot be a king over dogs. A human being cannot be a king to dogs or to apes, right? All apologies to Tarzan, right? You can't be a king over animals, right? A human being is a king only over other human beings. Why is that? Why is that? Because the quality of kingship is actually dependent on the other. The other is not a means to express my quality of kingship. My quality of kingship is constituted in that there is the other. Right? Does that make sense? In other words, the kind person, how does the object of my kindness exist to me? Right? If I'm an inherently kind person. The answer is, it is a means by which my kindness is expressed, but nothing else. Right? In other words, my love, this is the place that my love is expressed. But if it wasn't expressed here, would I express it elsewhere? Yes. Kingship is not like that. Kingship, the other is necessary even for me to have the kingship. The other is necessary for me to have the kingship. It's not like I'm a king regardless, right? Like I'm kind regardless, and I'm just looking for somewhere to express that trait, right? You're not a king regardless. The king is not walking around a king waiting to pick up a country, right? The king needs a people, right? There needs to be, at least, if not actually, then at least conceptually, there has to be a specific nation, and it has to have certain qualities, right? Like we said earlier tonight, they can't be too close, can't be your children. As we're saying now, also can't be too far below you, right? But can't be like an animal. Kingship is a very precise thing. I have people who are commensurate to me, but treat me as if I'm incommensurate to them. Again, I have human beings who are commensurate to me. I'm a human being like them. We have an inherent relationship. It's not like I'm infinitely above them, but they treat me as if I'm infinitely above them. That's a king, right? That's a king. And with nothing else can there be a king. Why is all of this so important? Why is all of this so important? Because if God, we're going to take our argument a step further. The first step was to say that why does God create a world that the world appears and perceives itself to be separate from him? Because only a world that perceives itself to be separate can he truly be a king over. If it wasn't separate, he can't be a king over it. Now we're going to take that a step further. We're going to take it a step further. Even if the world is never created separately from him, even if he creates the world only as a pure expression of godliness, no time and space, without time and space, right? He creates the world as the truth of the world really is, right? As people know from earlier classes, without Shem Elokim. If he created the world only with what we've been calling Shem Havaya, right? He creates the world purely as perceiving itself as totally dependent on and merely an expression of godliness in every way, with no independence from him whatsoever. Nevertheless, because Malchus, because kingship is a divine attribute, Because God has an attribute of kingship, the world would nevertheless be important to God. The world would nevertheless be important to God. It's the exact same thing I was saying before. Yehi right? There's two problems with Yehi. There's two aspects to Yehi let there be light. When God says let there be light, right? There's two things. There's two things going on here. First of all, because he wants to be a king, when he says let there be light, right, he's actually saying it to create a reality that perceives itself as independent of God. As we've spoken about before, right, it's the letters, which are the Shem Elokim, which form that and create the concealment of the pure godly revelation, etc., right? Tzimtzum, Shem Elokim, concealment of God, right? That's one thing that God does. And why does he do that? Because he wants to be a king, right? Remember, speech is Malchus, right? He speaks Yehi right? He speaks Yehi let there be light. Speech is Malchus. Speech is kingship. He says, let there be light, and he speaks those words in such a way that it creates a reality that perceives itself as independent. Yes? Because he wants to be a king. So he needs an independent reality. Now we're saying something even deeper. We're saying that even if all that was here was Yehi even if all that was here was the divine utterance, let there be light, there is no light. There is no result of the process, as we've been putting it in other classes. There is no reality created by him saying, let there be light. All there is the words, let there be light. All there is the divine expression. That divine expression inherently implies the existence of time and space and a world, because it's an expression of Malchus. In other words, why is he talking at all? Right? Why is he talking at all? The divine trait of speech, the divine trait of Malchus, exists purely for the purpose of the other. If you were the only human being on planet Earth, you would not speak. There would be no need. Right? And yet, God, in the creation of the world, speaks. So when does the other exist? When is there a contradiction to the divine unity? When is there something other than God here? Not when the speech is concealed and produces a world that perceives itself separate from him. In the very act of speaking, he has already implied that there's something separate from him. You understand the distinction? Understand the distinction? Is everyone with me, more or less? So the divine trait of kingship, also known as speech, implies inherently that the world has some level of independence from godliness. Right? The world's independence from God is not, as we've been saying, an effect that he creates only for our perspective through Shem Elokim. It's not only a perspective of reality that's created by his self-concealment, right, as we've been saying. It appears to be an aspect that is true as much as God himself is true, right? To say such a thing, right? If we could say such a thing. In other words, the very fact that he is king and wants to be king, even before he creates a world, that means the world has importance and there is something that has reality to it other than the divine reality. So that's the question. That's the question.
Because everything is within God.
Everything is inside.
Yeah, but the thing is, right, that's why we feel so violated after 6 chapters by this question, right? Because the whole assumption has been that if it's godly, it's united with God, and therefore is no contradiction. Now we're saying, remember what I said? I said, we, at the end of chapter 6, the Alter Rebbe mentions it, just briefly, he says, we have to look at the nature of the divine speech itself, right? The source of the worlds. Chapters 1 through 6 is how does the world totally nothing in relation to its source. It has no independent reality from its source. Chapter 7, all of a sudden, we're saying, hang on, look at the source. What's the source? The source is this divine speech, this malchus, this kingship. The kingship implies a nation. The speech implies someone to hear the speech, an object of the speech, an externalization. In other words, the problem of achdus, the problem of the divine unity, that nothing is independent of him, doesn't begin with the world's existence, right? Whatever existence means, according to the first 6 chapters of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, that very slight veneer over the true reality of things, right? That thin simulation, that facade, right? But that facade is not what means the world exists independent of God. The world existing independent of God exists the moment he opens his mouth, so to speak, right?
But why does it need somebody to hear it?
What?
God speaks and he speaks.
No, but that's what speech is, inherently. That's the point. That's what speech is. If it were for no one to hear, it would be thought. But it's not. It's speech. It's a divine quality, malchus. The 10th divine trait is that God is a king. And to be a king implies, it would seem, being a king over other things, right? To express that kingship. Let's put it that way.
So there is a thing, Adon Olam. What is actually the source of that?
Of Adon Olam, I'm not exactly sure. I don't know.
It says, הוא היה,
Yeah,
הוא יהיה, ואחרי ככלות הכל,
Yimlach Nara, yes. You're right. And B'terem Kol Yetzer Nivra, right? Right. So before he creates the world, he's king. After he creates the world, he's king. So there's a distinction to be made between the expression of his kingship and his inherent quality of kingship, which is really beyond the scope of our class. In other words, the answer to that question is a very... it's spoken about in Chassidus. It's very deep and very difficult. That really would get into the weeds relative to the level of our class. The quick answer for our purposes is that there's a difference between God does have a certain trait of inherent kingship. In other words, there is such a thing as being a king without a nation, and God has that as well, even before he emanates any of the 10 spheres, even before he speaks, right, all of these things. That's not what we're talking about here. Here, we're talking about a revelation of his kingship. In fact, the Alter Rebbe specifically says that his kingship should be revealed, not that he should be king, right? It's all about revelation, expressing. He wants to express his kingship. Right? But if God wants to express his kingship, the problem with the divine unity begins not when that kingship is expressed by creating a world which appears to be independent, but in the very expressing of kingship itself. That's what kingship is by definition. Just like what speech is by definition is to the zulas, to the other, to the person other than God. Yes? So we've basically added only one nukuda here. We've added only one point to what we said last week. The one point we've added is that the fact that kingship creates a reality independent of him begins not when that independent reality is actually created, but is inherent to kingship itself. It's inherent to his trait of kingship, his trait of majesty, of ruling over the universe itself. That trait inherently means that there is room for time and space. The universe matters. This truly has the universe is truly of substance and importance to God, even before it's created, right? This contradicts the idea that nothing exists independent of godliness whatsoever. So the question is, how do we deal with this? And the answer is that Malchus is only one of 10 spheres. Malchus, the divine kingship, the divine trait of majesty of kingship, is only one of 10 spheres. If the universe was created by chesed, right, by God's kindness, for example, to pick one of the other 9. If the universe were created by God's kindness, then we wouldn't have this problem. Because the kindness, as we were just saying, right, kindness can express anywhere. Kindness is just about self-expression. So if the universe were created from kindness, there is no inherent contradiction in God being kind and God being the only thing that truly exists. Right? In other words, the truth is that in some sense, even when we're kind to others, right, in a sense, we are the only thing that truly exists in that relationship, in one sense. Not from the perspective of the person receiving our love and kindness, right? That's a separate issue. Obviously, they have a separate reality. But from my perspective, from my perspective, I'm a kind person, I'm going to be kind anyway. Let's say I'm a charitable person. Let's make it very concrete, right? I'm a charitable person. I'm going to be charitable regardless, right? In other words, it's not that I need this specific outlet for my charity. This is where I like to give. This is where it's connected to me in some way. But inherently, if this thing didn't exist, I would be kind in giving my.
You're saying that Malchut is the only one that requires duality of, a king?
In a sense, yes. Malchus is the only one that from the perspective of the giver, right? Let's leave aside the perspective of the receiver, because when we talk about God, there's a whole question of whether there even is a perspective of the receiver, right? Let's put that's too complicated for us. Let's put that aside for a moment. From the perspective of the giver, from the one who gives over, you can give kindness, right? You can relate in kindness, or you can relate in Malchus, you can relate in kingship. Relating in kindness is a relationship in which the other is merely a recipient of something that is being expressed anyway, right? God is kind regardless of whether there's someone to be kind to. Kingship is not like that. Kingship, he's not expressing kingship regardless of whether there's someone to rule over. It's a contradiction, right? There's no such thing. The very fact that he expresses kingship means that there must be, at least potentially, at least in some way, there must be something over which to rule over. Yes? So if the world was created from chesed, if the world was created from the divine kindness, then it would be totally... we wouldn't have this contradiction, right? We would solve the two contradictions. The first contradiction to his unity is that, the world appears to exist independent of him. To answer that, we have the first 6 chapters of Tanya, right? Of the part 2 of the Tanya, which explain how this apparent reality is not the truth and the world is totally united with him and only an expression of godliness. And then to answer the second question, but the divine expression thinks the world is important. The answer is, who says? God's kindness, if the world is created by his kindness, who says? He's kind, right? And his kindness is regardless. He would be kind regardless. It happens to be that there's a world here to receive it. So the world is of no importance. In other words, the world is not necessary in the equation, right? The world happens to be, he happens to create it, but the world is of no inherent, it's not in the driving position. It's not compelling its own existence in any way. But since that's not what we say, since we say the world is created through the divine speech, and because God wants to be king, because it's created through Malchus, right? Therefore, the world, and why is it created through Malchus? Because he wants it to be independent of him, right? Right? Why does he create it through Malchus? Because he wants a reality which is separate from him. It's created through the divine trait of kingship because he needs a reality which perceives itself as separate. Right? If it was created through Chesed, it wouldn't perceive itself as separate. If it creates it through Malchus, it perceives itself as separate through his kingship. Yes? And now we have a problem. Because since it is created from Malchus, right, it appears to be that the world is of inherent importance. God needs the world to fully express his kingship, in other words. Right? God needs the world. To express his kingship, he needs the world. Right? Obviously, this is not really a question of God needing something, because the truth is that his need to express his kingship is itself by choice. Right? In other words, the whole question doesn't even begin, because obviously he wants to need to express his kingship. If you understand what I'm saying, it's a choice. It's a choice. God chooses to need to express his kingship, or the desire to express his kingship. Right? So it's not really a question on God needing, God forbid. That's not the question. The question is that since he is expressing his kingship, once he has made that decision and is expressing his kingship, implicit in his kingship is the importance and the true existence of the world. Right? You see the contradiction. The answer to the first 6 chapters is now our problem. Right? The answer, which is that everything is the divine speech, is now our issue. Right, is now our issue. If everything is the divine speech, right, and the divine speech and the divine speech is inherently for the purpose of creating everything, ipso facto, everything is important to God. Everything is relevant. Everything is independent of independent importance, right? At least within his desire to be king, right? The world has its own importance. Contradiction to the divine unity. We answer this question as follows. We answer the question as follows. Here's the solution. The solution that God comes up with, right? Now we're going to learn about it. What does God do? He wants to create a world which is separate from him, so he needs Malchus, right? But that appears separate from him, right? So that he can be king over it, which is why he has kingship, right? He expresses himself through the trait of kingship, through the trait of majesty. However, this world is also to not be a contradiction to his achdus, to his absolute unity. How is this accomplished? The answer is through the other spheres. We get the advantages of both. We get the advantage of chesed, that his act of creation does not necessitate the need for the world, right? Does not lend the world importance. But he gets the advantage of malchus, the advantage of speech or kingship, that the world truly does appear separate from him, right? Those are the two advantages. The best of both worlds. He has the non-contradiction to his unity of the higher spheres, the higher 9 spheres, right? But he has the self-perceived separate reality of malchus. Right? He has the best of both worlds. Does everyone understand what I mean by the phrase of the best of both worlds?
He created the other 9 just to support this one.
I don't know about that, but 1 second. We'll talk much more about this. But do you understand what I mean by the best of both worlds, though? Important that you understand what I mean.
The other spheros emanate through Malchus.
That's sort of what El was saying. Yeah, that's true. But the point is that to Chesed, the world is not a necessity. To Malchus, it is. Right? But on the other hand, to Chesed, the world is not separate in any way, whereas to Malchus, it is. He wants it to be both separate and unnecessary. Right? He wants it to be separate, mitzad Malchus, and unnecessary, mitzad Chesed. Right? Sorry, I slipped into Hebrew. He wants it to be separate from his kingship, and he wants it to be unnecessary from the other 9 spheres. So what do? And you combine the best of both worlds, is you combine the spheres. Malchus, the last sphera, is united with the other 9. Malchus, the last sphera, the last mode of expression, the divine kingship, is united with the other 9 divine modes of expression. It's not separate, it's united. And because it's united, we have both advantages. That's the summary of the answer. What that means, we will be explaining next week and the coming weeks in much more detail. But the short version of the answer is that Malchus, God's speech, does not act alone. God's speech acts concurrent with the other 9 spheres. It acts together with the other 9 spheres, and so we have the best of both worlds. Now, the unity of Malchus, the unity of God's kingship with the other 9 modes of expression happens in 2 ways. There's a higher level unity and a lower level unity. There's a Shema Yisrael and there's a Baruch Shem. This is where the rubber meets the road, in other words, in Achdus Hashem. This is where the higher and the lower are united, right? So there's 2 unities. So when we speak of the higher level unity and the lower level unity, which one is the unity of the world with God's speech? And the answer is neither. Neither is the unity of the world with God's speech. The unity of the world with God's speech is before you even get to the lower level unity. Right? The unity of the world with God's speech is just to realize that what the problem is not the world. What the problem is Malchus. If you understand what I'm saying. The first 6 chapters of the second part of Tanya is to help you realize that the real issue is not the world. The world is nothing other than Malchus. Is nothing other than the divine speech. Malchus is just another name for the divine speech in our context. Yes? The world is nothing other than the divine speech. The whole problem...
And kingship being the same.
Pardon? Say again?
Speech and kingship
yes.
being the same.
What about them?
Are they the same?
Yes, they're synonymous. Pardon me. Sorry, I tried to say that earlier clearly. Maybe it wasn't clear. The divine speech and the divine kingship are synonymous. They both come from the divine trait of Malchus. Malchus is both. Malchus is called the mouth, speech, and it's also called kingship. Two modes of relationship that depend on the other. Right? They depend on an external reality. Speech and kingship. Anyway. So the real problem, says the Alter Rebbe in chapter 7, the first 6 chapters is to realize that the world has no reality whatsoever other than Malchus, right? Whether you're talking about his, other than the divine speech, whether you're talking about the divine self-revelation, which we've been calling Shem Havaya, or the divine self-concealment, which is called Shem Elokim, right? All of these things are just different aspects of the one act of the divine speech, right? That's what we say in the first 6 chapters, right? From God's perspective, there is no world, there is only the divine speech which is speaking. Right? That's all that there is here. That's all that this reality is the divine speech. Chapter 7 is when we say, now what about the divine speech itself? That's where the real problem is, so to speak. The first 6 chapters were a preface. The first 6 chapters were our introduction. The real problem in the unity of God is Malchus versus the other 9 spheres. Right? The real problem of unity is that God is creating the world. He wants a world which is separate from him, but by the very act of creating a world which is separate from him, he is creating a world that has importance. Right? How do we get around this? How do we get around the inherent importance of the world? How do we get to the conclusion that the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya that Kula Kamei Kaloi Chashiv, everything before him is as nothing? right? He doesn't need the world. He doesn't need to create the world. The world is not relevant to God, even in the act of creation. How is that possible? Because the divine speech is united with the 9 other divine expressions. Malchus is united with the other spheres, and it's united in two ways. Either the higher spheres come down to meet Malchus, which is the lower level unity, or Malchus ascends to unite with the higher spheres, which is the higher level unity. Again, either the higher modes of divine expression come down to invest within God's speech, in which case there's a lower level unity, or God's speech ascends to unite with his higher traits, his higher qualities, which is the higher level of the divine unity. These two unities of either Malchus going up or the other spheres coming down, the other modes of divine expression coming down, is what we refer to every day when we say Shema Yisrael and Baruch Shem. Shema Yisrael refers to the divine unity of Malchus ascending to the other modes of divine expression. Baruch Shem refers to the divine unity of the other divine modes of expression coming down to be within Malchus.
But we say in one sentence.
Yeah.
This is the concept of Oishab or Chozeh.
Very likely, yeah, very likely. I think Alter Rebbe may even mention it later. I believe so.
But the conflict still remains because in one hand,
Yeah,
God doesn't need us.
yeah,
On the other hand, He created us.
yeah.
He created us. He created because He wanted us to be created.
Ah.
So He does need us.
This is the mystery. That's what the rest of Tanya is about. That's what the rest of the book's about. The rest of the book is about if we don't really matter to Malchus, if we don't really matter to the divine kingship, as we're going to explain, then what are we doing here? Basically, yeah. Why are we here? Yeah. Why are we here? The answer is, as the Alter Rebbe says in the first part of Tanya, is that we are not here for a reason. That's the answer. The answer is we are here because God wants us to be here, but it is a want not backed by reason, right? There is no reason why God wants it. If you ask why does He want it, the answer is He wants it. There is no reason. Actually, you could go, yeah, whatever. But why? Why does God being expressed in the lowest worlds? Why does that matter to Him? And the answer is I have no idea. You could add one more step. You could say why does He want it? You could say because it's geschmack, because He enjoys it. Right? Because you could say Tainug is higher than Ratzon if you want, right? Pleasure is higher than will.
Then He needs us.
No, but then why does He enjoy it? And the answer is no reason. There's no reason. That ultimately it's all by God's choice. There is no inherent need for anything to be here. That's the exact point that we're saying. In other words, if everything is by the divine choice, if you're in a relationship where everything is determined specifically by what you want at any given time, that means no one else exists in the relationship. That's the entire point. If there is something about them that compels you to want them or want a certain thing, you no longer have that position of only I am here. Right? If there's something about the world that compels God to create it, right? If there's something about you that makes me need to be in a relationship with you in some way, because of who I am, I need to be in a relationship with you, right? That means I am not God. That's what the Alter Rebbe is saying. To be God is to not need to be in that relationship. The only thing that makes him be in that relationship is his will. Right? That's the fundamental point. That's kula kamei kalei chashiv. Everything is before him as nothing. Everything is as nothing before him. Yeah.
You want to be in a relationship for the other, not for self.
Yeah.
What relationship is that?
That's what we're supposed to realize at the end of the day, right? In other words, if God doesn't need us in any way, and we're only here because He wants us, right? What does that mean? That means that we are here basically purely on His kindness. In other words, that's like the famous midrash which says, why does God create the world? Because He saw the souls of the people who would live in the world, and therefore He asked them, should I create the world? And they said yes. Right? In other words, the image of what the world would be, right, made Him want to create it. Right? So in other words, not in a way that it compelled Him, though. In other words, not in contradiction to what we've been saying. I've been expressing it poorly. The point is...
You've been expressing it pretty accurately.
Oh, well, thank you. But the point is that we are here purely on God's kindness. right? We are here as an act of selflessness of God, fundamentally, right? We are here as an act of selflessness, and the entire purpose of our life, right? The entire purpose of our life is to repay that act of selflessness, in a sense. Or, to put it in a much less transactional sense, right? To put it in a less contractual sense, and to put it in a deeper and more essential and a truer sense, the reason why we are here, as it says in Hayom Yom, is God makes something from nothing. We are here to make nothing from something, right? We are here to return ourselves back to that state of absolute unity in which nothing other than Him exists. That's why we're here.
What makes so many people
Yeah.
become all about themselves? Me, I.
We spoke about that. Yeah, we spoke about that in the first 6 chapters. That everything perceives itself as an I. Everything perceives itself as an I. Everything perceives itself as an independent reality by God's choice. Well, God makes us that way. But the point is that we're supposed to see through that. We're supposed to develop a deeper understanding and to see through that. All right. God willing, next week we begin to learn inside the answer to the question. God willing.